Okay. There are 19 students registered for the class. I'm going to wait without calling roll till about 10:30. The reason for that being there's always pupils who don't know where the classroom is, and even some who might not even know where the campus is. I mean, that can happen. So I'll wait about calling roll till later, then I'll stop and call roll. I mean, if you're wondering what I'm looking at, I do have most of your pictures right here, the ones of your registration photos. I'm trying to learn your names. And, anyway, for me, that's not easy. I have to confess to you. And all Asian men look alike to me. I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
A lot of Asian women look alike to
that.
me.
That's not nice to say.
Huh?
That's not nice to say because I'm Asian.
Yeah.
I don't believe that I look like. the rest of
Okay,
them.
I'm sorry, but it's my perception. I mean, okay, I'm just saying. I do have a little bit of a difficult time learning names. It has been a problem throughout my adult life, childhood, or whatever. Okay. All right. I'll probably repeat what I said because I'm a little bit early. Oh yeah, by the way, my phone, 2 minutes ago, I turned it off. Do any of you have the syllabus? One person, that's like two. That's not surprising. Because part of the reason I did not get it online until a couple of days ago, Wednesday, I believe, maybe even yesterday. I'm part-time, and being part-time, I never know whether I have a class or not. So I chose to teach a Friday class this summer, knowing that most full-time teachers do not want a Friday class. And in fact, as far as I know, none of them want one. So I'm here. But anyway, it's kind of hard because I never know whether I'm going to actually have a class or not. Leaving that, though, this is your text, 8th edition, Dwight Prince Spielberg. I started teaching here in the year 2000. We were using Dwight Prince Spielberg at that moment. So we're still using Dwight Prince Spielberg. I've gotten used to them fairly well. Anyway, that's our text. Now, I do not care what edition you have. If you have the 7th edition, you can do a lot cheaper. Or if you have the 5th, 4th, 3rd, or 2nd edition, they're not that much different from one edition to the next, except only about the 5th edition or so. They took chapter 12 and made it 2 chapters, chapters 12 and 13. But other than that, there's just not that much different. But it has to be Dwight Prince Spielberg. If you have the essential world history of the same authors, that's okay also. But again, it has to be, because you might think all history is the same. No, it isn't. Different authors emphasize different things. And this book will have things that other books won't have, and vice versa. So again, Dwight Prince Spielberg, I don't care what edition. All right. By the way, just to introduce it, this is World History first semester. We'll go up to the year 1500 if at all possible, and I'm going to try hard to. For the first time in the 18 years I've taught here, I am not going to assign a paper. The reason for that is I'm going to be assigning a test at the end of every class. And if you wonder, part of the reason for that is I have to turn right around, 15 minutes later, go downstairs and teach another class. And so that means I'll be lecturing for 6 hours. So you'll have it, your first test is next week. Again, folks, this is summer school. We only meet 7 times. Your second test is the week after that, and you'll be able to test each week. You have a whole week to prepare for it. As you might wonder, what should you prepare for? The stuff that's on the board. Now, if you've been to iCollege, you'll notice there's some lectures from my 2016 class, and I decided to do the same thing again here. So I've got my camera rolling. I'll probably wind up putting the lecture online. I say it's probably because I have a whole week to do that in between now and next Friday. So it takes me a few hours. I mean, I have to condense it to a format that can go onto YouTube and et cetera, et cetera. All right. Before I proceed, do any of you have any questions? Okay. Now, when I've got something like this, at this point I wonder, where do I start? Well, I guess I'll just start at the beginning. But before I start, there is another reason for this camera. As college teachers, we were supposed to have what's called academic freedom. I try to use it very responsibly, but sometimes I will say things that's offensive to some people. I'm not going to apologize for it. I've got to say what I believe is the truth. And I had a student really get really upset at me last fall, last time I taught here, that I told what I believe is the truth. And she wanted me to apologize. I would not do it. You are not protected from offensive speech. Are we clear on it? Now, I had a couple of students come to me from, they came to the back rooms and said, you're allowed to teach whatever you want to. I said thank you to them. You're adults now, we're all adults spoke. If you don't like another opinion than the one you're used to, you'd better get used to it, because you'll be hearing all the wrong opinions all your life. I mean, I'll sometimes turn the radio on and hear things that just make me really mad. But they have a right to say that. And sometimes, folk, turns out they are right. A lot of opinions I used to hate, I now hold. A lot of beliefs I used to shun, I now believe. But again, remind you, you are not protected from offensive speech. But again, this is partly for my protection and maybe for yours. And also, it might benefit you to hear the lectures online. All right. With that out of the way, now, what I'm going to do about the syllabus, because most of you don't have it, that's understandable. I'll go over it next class. So this class, I'll just get started. Chapter 1. Chapter 1, book starts off with the ancient times. Now, modern day Western academia, and I'm talking about all of Western, that includes North America, South America, and Europe, has one fundamental assumption. The assumption being that there is nothing spiritual and there's a natural explanation for everything, and basically that there is no God, and that everything came into existence all by itself. Fundamental assumption. The authors make that assumption. I wish I had some soap. I'd wash my mouth out. Having said that, you might can guess I don't believe it. Nevertheless, it's a fundamental assumption, and you will see it in your book if you read it. Again, they take the evolutionary point of view that man evolved from lower animals over a course of multiplied millions of years. I'm not going to ask you to learn the names of the various animals we evolved from, but I do want to point out two. These were human: Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal man. Some years ago, I did a study of my own DNA. And these DNA studies are becoming popular, and they are becoming cheaper. And you can find out a lot about your ancestry.
Sorry, I can't find your classroom.
I understand. In fact, I made a little speech about that a few minutes ago. Yeah. All right, anyway. I did a study of my own DNA, and I'm of R1b haplogroup, and that's the Cro-Magnon man is also R1b. The Neanderthal man is somewhat controversial. He's supposedly older than the Cro-Magnon man. The Cro-Magnon man is very human. We think of these men as being primitive, but something about them, though, I must mention, both of them were taller and bigger than the average modern man. And if this is any indication of their intelligence, they both had a larger brain capacity than modern humans do. Indicating, I have a zoology book here at the house I've had for more than 51 years, but even the authors suggest that modern humans might be degenerate. In other words, instead of evolving upward, devolving downward. And folk, if you actually study the fossil record, it looks like life on Earth was once better and bigger and more adapted than life today. The animals you see in the fossils are bigger than today's. The snakes you see are bigger. And right here in Georgia, we have giant sloths. A sloth that's as big as an elephant. Buffaloes were bigger than elephants, than modern day elephants, that is. This, I mean, you can verify by looking it up. So indicating that modern, instead of plants and animals going upward, going downward. Trees, oh yeah, the giant sequoia trees were small compared to the fossilized trees that we're finding. The sequoias, get 300 feet tall. One of them fell down recently. But anyway, to me, it shows that life is actually heading downward and not upward. But nevertheless, fundamental assumption is that life is getting bigger and better all the time. We learn a lot about ourselves by studying our DNA. And in 1986, folk, 32 years ago, we made a really surprising discovery about when we studied human DNA. We learned that all human females are descended from one woman. Yes.
Say that one more time.
What's that?
Can you say that one more time?
Say it a bit more clearly.
I said, can you say that one more time?
Yeah, I can say it several more times. All human females are descended from one woman. If you have a hard time understanding that, I mean, hey, I can understand why. Then they discovered that all human males are descended from one male. Yes, yeah.
Is the man called Lucy?
No, Lucy is a primate, a female primate. That's why the name, Lucy is a girl's name in Western culture. Lucy is a girl's name. Lucy is a female primate, but she is not the ancestor. Now, what do we call this one ancestor? And if the name would ring a bell, it comes from a book that's not even allowed to be in our public schools. Eve. We call her mitochondrial Eve. I've got that name on the board already. We call her Eve. And Adam, well, yeah, okay, the male we call Adam. Now, here's the problem. Eve would have lived many, many years before Adam. You might ask, well, how can that be? Every human being has heard a story about a huge catastrophe that killed everyone on the earth except for one man and his sons and their wives. This is another story called the flood story. The flood story, folks, is not only written in the Bible, it's not only written in cuneiform tablets, but it is written in cuneiform tablets, several of them. I have more to say about cuneiform later. It's written in our DNA. Our DNA shows clearly that there must have been a disaster, maybe more than one, that almost wiped out the entire human race. All right, anyone have any comments? If I've opened up with a bang, I meant to. It's going to get more weird. If I can use that word, it will. Anyway, supposedly the human race, I say suppose, started out in Africa, where they have Adam and Eve living here, but they're about 140,000 years apart. About there. I don't agree with the dates. This is not the Bible I'm showing you. This is National Geographic, and it's as pro-evolution and anti-Christian as it gets. And yet they are proving. They're proving what they did not intend to prove. They're showing what they did not intend to show. And it shows how that all humanity spread out. And something that's really weird about this map. Right in this region here, they have all human females coming together in this region here and spreading out. The region is the region of Mount Ararat. Have any of you ever heard of Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey? What happened at Mount Ararat? That's where Noah's Ark was supposed to have landed. Here it is in orange and blue, whatever. The orange is the female lines, the blue is the male. Yes.
So are they taking back what they're saying about the?
They're not taking back anything. No, in spite of the evidence, they're still continuing to believe what they have always believed. Never mind the evidence, never mind the proof. Hope that answers your question. But nevertheless, they do teach it. I mean, if you look it up, look up mitochondrial Eve online. It's easy these days. It's easy to look up these things and look up Y chromosome DNA, from whom all human men are descended. Again, if you know anything about DNA studies, the Y chromosome is passed from father to son on down, and the mitochondria is something that only women have, and they pass it from mother to daughter on down. There have been a few noted exceptions here and there, where some men have gotten a mitochondria chromosome from their mothers occasionally, but every man has his Y chromosome DNA, and every woman has a mitochondrial chromosome that she passes from mother to daughter on down, and it gives absolute proof. Now again, some people have, speculated that, hey, maybe we should change something, but no, they have not changed their views. Their views remain what they were before, but nevertheless, folks, again, I'm trying hard not to teach mythology, but, I'll take that back. In a few minutes, I'm going to teach mythology really hard. All right. Again, Cro-Magnon man, Neanderthal man may have been bigger and better than modern man. Now, according to standard, and I do teach both sides, the standard and the non-standard. According to standard history, human beings originally were very primitive. They were food gatherers and hunters, and they made their living by following the herds. This is before they learned how to tame the herds. They followed the herds, and they hunted, and they lived in caves. Hey, I don't doubt it. Here's the thing. We have people today who follow the herds, people who are nomadic. Of course, in the case, a lot of nomads today, they lead tame animals, tame sheep, tame goats, and tame cattle. They lead their herds instead of following them. As for the cave people, every generation of humans have had cave people. We have people living in caves today. Some of them on iPads. Some of them have laptop computers and are connected to the internet in their cave. Yes, we do that. Now, your book has a picture of some high-quality oil paints on some caves in France. I've read about these. When you see a picture, if you meet a man who is homeless and lives under a bridge and has a cell phone, what does that tell you about his society, the society he comes from? He's living on the fringe of a highly advanced society. These oil paintings show a cave people who are using high-quality oil for their paints. They were living on the fringe of a highly advanced civilized society. They were not necessarily primitive. Now, I always say that man has gone up and down. There have been catastrophes. There have been ups and there have been downs. All right. Again, your book makes it sound like at one point, somewhere along the way, humans learned how to tame and domesticate animals and learned what plants to grab onto and to grow. I'm a little bit of a farmer myself. I have a little small postage stamp garden. My mother's ancestors were farmers, so I know a little bit about farming. I can imagine that one day some people saw this corn stalk growing and decided, hey, maybe I can raise this myself. Okay, that sounds logical till you realize that domesticated plants do not have any real near relatives in the wild that can produce fruit suitable for us. There's a gap between the domesticated plants and non-domesticated plants. Part of the gap is that domesticated plants, I'm talking about peas and corn and squash and potatoes. You have to put them in the ground, and then once there, you have to baby them, you have to hoe them, you have to fertilize them. Really ever fertilize the weed? You need to. Weeds just grow. They don't need water, they don't need fertilized, they don't need hoed. Your domesticated plants will tell you they need hoed, they need watering if it doesn't rain. They need all kinds of tending. Your wild plants, they just grow. Now, sheep. Your sheep is so dependent on man that they cannot survive without humankind and possibly never could. Can you picture that one time there was some wild sheep and some more Paleolithic ancestors found them, caught them, and brought them inside and brought them to their pen and tamed them? Couldn't have happened. A sheep cannot find water. They can't say that. If you don't take them to water, they'll die of thirst. If you go around the corner of a barn and the sheep didn't follow you, you'll never find you around the corner. You can't even go around the corner of a barn. How many of you have some idea what I'm talking about? One hand goes up. Okay. Most of you don't know probably the first thing about farming. I won't blame you.
I had a farm for 13 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had 4
Well, I
horses.
find growing plants fascinating. I mean, I have grapes and I have tomatoes and cherry tomatoes and peppers and blackberries and blueberries. It's just small stuff scattered out. My wife bought a blackberry plant home one time, and after a short time, it took over the whole garden. I had got a new garden now. They reproduce by spreading out. Really good stuff, though. But anyway, but again, your book makes it sound like that somewhere man learned how to domesticate animals and domesticate plants, and maybe somewhere along the way man learned how to make sounds with his throat and learn how to talk. Now, hold on to your seats. My view of it is that ancient man, the farther back in time you go, the higher and more advanced he is. And I'm going to point as an example of the pyramids of Egypt. They are built of blocks that we cannot move with our modern machinery. The blocks were quarried up to 1,000 miles away, and some of them weigh 50 tons. Say, if you don't believe it, look it up. So you said, really, at 50 tons? Yes. And furthermore, our best machinery cannot even lift them. How do you transport a 50-ton block 1,000 miles and then raise it up a couple hundred feet and put it on a... We can't do it. If the Great Pyramid was actually built in 20 years, they'd have had to lay a stone every minute, 1 minute and 15 seconds. They had working day and night. And put them in place so well that you can hardly get a knife blade between them. The point I'm trying to make, folk, is that these people were more advanced than we are. And somewhere along the way, we lost all this advancement. And we're only starting to begin to get it back. All right. Anybody have any questions? I've had students who tell me that they've studied the same stuff. All right. Anyway, now I'll have a little bit more to say about the pyramids later, but I want to talk about this word civilization. Civilization, suppose, is where you, the word civil means that people are civil. In other words, you have several things involved with civilization. One of them is a diversity of occupation. In other words, some of your people make their living by making shoes. Others make their living making clothes. Another man makes his living by farming, or family makes their living by farming. And another one makes his living by tanning hides, and another one by building, construction, another one by artwork, and some of them are government officials. You have diversities of occupation, and let's face it, people who make shoes all the time will make better shoes than a person who decides to, I'm going to just go buy some leather and see if I can put some shoes together. Oh yeah, when I was a kid, I tried it. I don't do it in my adult life. But eventually you say, hey, these people who do it all the time for a living can do it a lot better than I can, or try putting an automobile together. It would take a whole lifetime for one man to put a car together, every bit of it, from the time he's able to put a bolt and nut together. He'll be an old man by the time he gets that car working. By that time, some of the parts will be rusted down and no longer functional. The factories can put together one car every 30 seconds. One everything. That's how come they're so cheap. But yeah, believe me, they are cheap compared to what they would be if they. But anyway, that's diversity of occupation. That was the point I'm trying to make. Diversity of occupation. Then you have, to have a civil, you must have a government. To keep order, you have to have some kind of, the government has to have armies. Diversity of occupation, government. The government is usually, most of the time throughout history, has been headed by a king. Anyway, you have governments, you have armies, you have courts where people can settle their disputes peacefully. And folk going out in the streets and rioting, if something doesn't go your way, that's uncivilized. If I've offended anybody, you're offended to it. And civilized people, when something doesn't, you take it to court. And the judges do not always decide in your favor. You have to accept that. Elections do not always go the way you want them to. You have to accept that. All right, anyway, you have courts, and generally you have writing. Now, when I was a kid, so the teacher, what was civilization? And I thought, oh, they become civilized and have the ability to write. Well, that's a part of it. You have writing, you have written records, but you have people of diverse occupations working together in a certain level of harmony. Unfortunately, no civilization ever seen has been perfect. All right. Anyway, according to what your authors say, that somewhere along the way, man decided to civilize. Some of the earliest civilizations we know about started right here along the Tigris-Euphrates River in an area we call Mesopotamia. There's several names for it. It's called Mesopotamia, or the land between the rivers. It's also called the Fertile Crescent. Mesopotamia. Now, the word Fertile Crescent, that has to do with this area right here is somewhat crescent shaped. all this area here is desert. This is largely desert. But this area here is fertile, and this area is fertile. And they're together, so it's the crescent, fertile crescent. Mesopotamia means land between the rivers. The two rivers are the Tigris and Euphrates. These rivers joined together before they empty into the Persian Gulf. This is where civilization is said to have begun. Now, it's the most unlikely place on earth where civilization would have begun, because nothing grows there except for clay. Hardly any trees. Plant life is very difficult. A lot of the land here is marshland. But marshland, of course, has a lot of mosquitoes, which has a lot of vermin and a lot of diseases. And yet this is where civilization begun, and nobody can figure out why. But it was here they first set up schools. Well, yeah, civilized people generally oftentimes have schools. I must mention this. They have schools and religion. All right. Supposedly started out right here. Now, as we learn more about the civilization, we're finding out that civilization also started over here in the Indus Valley, just a little ways, just a little ways off the map here. And also, it appears that there were some civilizations in South America that it might be every bit as old as the Sumerian civilization. And then we might have some civilizations in the Far East, as far away as Vietnam and the South Sea Islands, that might also be as old as these. In other words, civilization might have sprung up all over the globe in patches at about the same time. But anyway, supposedly civilization sprang up. I say supposedly, if you want my opinion, mankind started out civilized, fully formed, fully civilized in the beginning. But again, this is not the standard view. The standard view is that mankind started out as animals and worked his way up and eventually pulled himself up by his own bootstraps and got better and better as time went on. And his grunts eventually became language. That's the standard view, folk. Now, okay, now I want to say a little bit more about Sumer. I'm going to start off with Sumer, but first I'm going to pause. Now, about roll call. If I mispronounce your name, feel free to correct me. Some of these names I have never seen before. All right, Michael Bennett. Michael. Quentin O'Brien. Enzo. Okay. Hope. I'm trying to make. I'm going to make up a seating chart. But Rainiel. Say again. Rainel. Rainel. Okay. Nairobi. Where? Oh, okay. Right. Oh, yeah. That's right. All right. Christopher. Okay. Regina. Patrick. Patrick. Damon. Okay. Chanda. Haley. Robert. Okay, is this Rasmy, R-A-S-M-Y?
Yes.
Rasmy, okay. I've seen the S and the M turn around to where it's Ramsey. And I've seen that name many a time.
I'm glad you got that.
What?
'Cause I'm glad you got that because people often do.
Yeah, well, because that name Ramsey is a common name.
Right.
Yeah, but anyway. Joseph.
Here.
All right. John Ross. Okay. Alexis Seymour. Alexis. Rodney. Okay, now this one I'm going to have trouble with. I'm going to spell it J-I-E-S-I.
Sorry, yeah, call me Jace.
Jace?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and you'll be in my next class, I understand also. Yeah,
Yes, sir.
okay. Meets right after this one, all right. Okay, now to double check, here are the absentees. Michael Bennett, Patrick Hutton, Rasmy Long. Now because this class only meets once a week, these absentees are going to have a little bit of a problem. I've got to talk to them for non-attendance. I can let them back in, but I have to talk to them. Again, if you ever take another class that meets 1 day a week, we've got 2 weeks to turn in our no shows. And on a class that meets 1 day a week, because those shows have to turn in after this class. So that does not apply to anyone in the sound of my voice. Now, I want to say this about dropping, folks. Please, if you decide you don't want to take the class, do me and you a favor and drop officially. Otherwise, if you keep your name on a roll, I am not allowed to drop here. All I can do at the end of the semester is give you a failing grade. And I have a little article on the syllabus about that. So drop officially. You can drop before the deadline without penalty, without prejudice. You can drop after the deadline. There is a penalty. You get a 0 that stays on your transcript. The failing grade. All right, are we clear? Okay.
See what the names that you called the last moments?
The what?
The last few names that you called out? What did you say? Because you called out my name. Karina.
I called your name, and your name is Raz.
Yeah, but you said it in the end, like you were the other.
Oh, I called out names of absentees only to double check.
Yeah, but I'm here because you said
Oh,
my name.
I did. Oh, my. Oh, I'm so sorry. Anyway, I've got you here. I've got you present. The names I called out, Michael Bennett, Patrick Hutton. Okay, there are only 2 absentees, and I called yours because that 1-1, that's for your first seat in the first row, it looks like an A. My bad writing. All right, that's what it was. 1-1 looks like an A. But anyway, when I make on a seating chart, I'll put you first. All right. Leaving it. Okay, the Sumerians. A lot of historians will say the Sumerians are the first people heard of. They're so new, in fact, to our history that I was in college before you even heard of them. One of my first graduate papers was on the Sumerians, and I've been studying them off and on ever since. One class I taught, I had the entire class do a paper on the Sumerians. Everybody may have this, again, you will not be assigned a paper. First time I've done that. We're taking the test instead. Anyway, the Sumerians, what's fascinating about them? Well, number one is that they were first. Then, the other thing that's fascinating about them is it appears, folks, that almost every major religion has its start with the Sumerians. The Sumerians seem to have invented the wheel, invented writing. They domesticated the cow, the camel, the cat, the dog, sheep, and learned how to grow barley, wheat, grains, and so that they seem to have, they were the developers of civilization, and their gods, it seems that all gods that we've ever served had their origin right here in Sumer, whether it be the Greek gods of Zeus, and the Romans called Jupiter and worship Saturn. They have a counterpart in Sumerian mythology, and the Norse gods of Thor and Odin, again a counterpart in Sumerian mythology. Thor, with his God being the god of lightning among the Norsemen, is equated with Zeus, the god of thunder with the Greeks, and Enlil, the god of thunder among the Sumerians. They wrote on clay. Now, here, all right, I want to give you something about what history is. How do we get history? The people living at the time wrote down their story, and then we today read it and try to make sense of it. That's history. You have your original sources, and you have your secondary sources. The original, another word for original is, better change that to primary. And secondary. Now, secondary sources where someone wrote about an event that happened hundreds of years before his time that he never saw. That's a secondary source. So when we have a modern day historian writing about George Washington, nobody alive can remember him, that's a secondary source. But when you have people around who met him, wrote about him, they're primary sources. However, in the ancient world, all of our records are copies of copies of copies of copies. And if you ever played a game of gossip, you start a story on this side of the room, by the time it gets over here, it's going to be different from what it started out. The people who copy will make a change here and there, Whoops, I said they all are copies of copies except for one. The Sumerian clay tablets written in cuneiform. These Sumerian clay tablets written in cuneiform wedge shape, they have survived untouched for 3,000 years. They are original. When we dig up a Sumerian clay tablet and read it, we're reading it like a time capsule, something that somebody read, they wrote back down there, it was buried, forgotten about, then we dig it up. Fascinating. In other words, we're actually reading original stuff. There's one problem with the Sumerian tablets, though. A serious problem. We don't believe what they tell us. I will run your seats. The Sumerians told us that their gods lived in temples. Well, what's all the ancient people know? Their gods had a physical, actual physical presence in their temples, to the point where they actually had to be fed, they had to eat and drink. And they had children by human women. This they actually said, and they taught this as serious history. How many of you know, probably all of you know, who was Hercules' father? Any of you know? Hercules' father was Zeus. The city of Mycenae in Greece. Greece, they believed that they were descended from Hercules. The Greek people could name to God that they were descended from. I said they had vivid imaginations, perhaps so. Every ancient group believed that the gods once lived on the earth and walked among humans and interacted with humans on a flesh and blood physical level. But they might say, well, that wasn't exaggerated. Well, again, I want to remind you, folks, what you're reading is not a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. What you're reading is the originals. You can take that for whatever you want to. I have asked many a class, and possibly asked this, what do you think about the Sumerian? One girl, it was 2003, and I had students write about Sumerians. This student wrote a line that I haven't forgotten to this day. She said, what you believe about the Sumerians will depend on your worldview, whether you have a religious belief or a secular belief. What you believe will depend on your worldview. All right. The Sumerian gods could explain why that these people so suddenly and so swiftly civilized themselves. Well, that's what they said. They could even explain the existence of the great pyramids in Egypt. Now, your book has a little bit more to say, but there is a line in the book that I always, yeah, on page 11 in your latest book. I mean, if you have the, otherwise it's in all the books. One of the most famous lines from the Sumerian clay tablets. It's about the city of Ur. Now, for those of you who don't know, apparently, I mean, I'm talking to a class, most of you apparently are not all that familiar with the Bible, even though we live right here in the middle of this campus is located in the middle of a Jewish community. Ur was a city that Abraham came from, the ancestor of the Jews. Here's the story about Ur. I want to quote, read it. Ur is destroyed. Bitter is its lament. The country's blood now fills its holes like bronze in a mold. Bodies dissolve like fat in the sun. Our temple is destroyed. The gods have abandoned us. Like migrating birds, they abandoned us like migrating birds. Smoke lies on our city like a shroud. Now, folks, what this is describing, I want to remind you of something, what I just said a few minutes ago. The city of Ur, like all of Mesopotamia, was built off clay. Have you ever tried to light clay in a fire? See one head shaking, you know what? It won't light. How then? And keep in mind, they didn't hardly use paper, they wrote on clay tablets. How then did the city of Ur get set on such a bright fire that it dissolved their bodies, and their lower part, their holes were filled up with dissolving bodies? What he is describing is nothing less bad than a nuclear holocaust, of which you find a lot of references to in the ancient world. Now, I know all of you have been told, oh, man did not learn how to split the atom until 1945. Our ancient ancestors were possibly doing it long before then. They would look on our, what I believe is true, we're going to run into this when we come to India and the Vedas. The Vedas believed in spaceships and believed that man had traveled the planets. The people who wrote the Vedas. Much more advanced than we are. And folks, it's just been less than 24 hours ago that the JPL said that there was evidence that there was once possibly life on Mars. Some of you might have picked up on it. At least one of you looking at it like you've heard some of this before. It is believed by some persons who have studied issue that Abraham was told by God, hey, get out of this city because I'm going to destroy it. So he got out, and the Jews today are just about the only known descendants of the Sumerians. Abraham himself was a Sumerian. I can pretty well guess which ones of you are Jews. I don't want to say how I used to look like. I can pretty well guess. Enough of that. Anyway, all right. No offense, my wife is not Jewish, so in case you're wondering it, yes, I will go on record. I'm on the record saying I'm pro-Israel. So, but anyway, the rest of these Sumerians were destroyed in a fiery nuclear holocaust. Your book was, anyway, but to make long story short, they went out of existence and were forgotten about. Only around 1850, when we started digging into the area around Ur and Duma and Lagash and Eridu, only then did we start discovering their existence. 1850 or so. Now, as for their gods, they believed that their gods had the ability to fly. I mean, hey, if you've ever read the Marvel comics or watched a Marvel movie about, they're depicting a world that might have existed, where their gods had superhuman abilities and only the ability to fly. When the going got tough, those gods took up wings and got out of there fast. They were no help. And I think those gods had a whole lot to do with why the Sumerian civilization came to an end. Are you following me? Hey, I know it's difficult to keep a class awake at this time of day, but I think I'm doing a fairly decent job of it. If you're shocked, okay, I was told when I was a freshman, the first thing a college professor should do is to pry open closed, complacent minds. I'm trying to do that, folk. Do I believe that those gods actually resided in temples and actually mated with earth women? Yes, I do. Do I believe that they should have? No, they shouldn't have, and the Sumerians had every bit, should have kicked them out. There was the Sumerians who called them in. There was Sumerians who began to worship them, and it was Sumerians who were destroyed, and their memory perished from the face of the earth. As a warning to everybody else, if we do as they did, the same thing that happened to us has happened to them. All right. I've said my lines. They were the first, and see, the people who came later did not even remember that they were, when they learned to write, did not remember the Sumerians were the ones who invented writing. They worshiped gods without realizing the Sumerians were the one who had initially started these gods. And they set up institutions, including the institution of kingship and priesthood, kings and priests and scribes, without realizing the Sumerians who got this started. But they forgot about the Sumerians. All right, moving on. Again, I have to move on. North of the Sumerians were the Akkadians. The Sumerians from the south, the Akkadians were from the north. The Akkadians were a Semitic people. Now, the Sumerians tended to live down in here, in this marsh region. The Akkadians a little bit farther north. Now, I said they were Semitic. All right, that word Semitic means, now I'm surprised at how many college students do not know this, but what I'm about to say. Semitic means descended from Shem, who was one of the 3 sons of Noah. To this day, from time to time, now that you've heard it, you'll see references. The Iraqis are Semitic. Their neighbors, the Iranians, are not. The Iranians are Indo-European. But your Semitic peoples started out mostly in Arabia and went from Arabia to Mesopotamia. And some of them went into what is today Israel. The Egyptians were not Semitic, but they were now. I say that because from time to time you'll see the word, and this is a very important word, What does an anti-Semite mean? If you're afraid to say it, I don't blame you. I think a couple of you might know. It means against the Jews. Adolf Hitler was an anti-Semite. Stalin was not. For all the evil you can say about Stalin, he was not anti-Semitic. Stalin voted to create the nation of Israel in the UN in 1948. This is in the record book. Hitler was dead by that time. Anti-Semite means strong against the Jews. The Jews are Semitic. All right. Anyway, the Akkadian, we call them Semitic because the language, personally I think we call them Semitic because of their DNA makeup. One of the first famous Akkadian kings was Hammurabi. Now actually, Babylon was an Akkadian city. And here's where the first time I mentioned the name Babylon. Supposedly, Babylon, they built a tower whose top would somehow touch the heavens. The project failed. But anyway, Babylon, the first great ruler of Babylon was Hammurabi. In the case of Hammurabi, we have a record of his law code. Your book shows a picture of the big stele, it's called, don't worry about that name, but where they had his code of laws. His code of laws reminds us somewhat of Moses' laws. He's called for an eye for an eye. You know, if you punch somebody else's eye out, your eye should be punched out. If you knock the person's tooth out, you should have one of your teeth knocked out, a hand for a hand, an arm for an arm, which was later repeated by the Hebrew lawgiver Moses. Hammurabi built himself up an empire. Here's the story we have. Now, again, there's a whole lot more than I'm going to mention. If I had a whole semester, I'd go into more detail, but to make a long story short, what you're going to see throughout much of history is a powerful ruler comes up, and he's not content to be the ruler in his own city. He goes out and he wants to conquer other cities. And this is what Hammurabi did over a period of 30 years. Can you give me your name?
Michael Bennett.
Oh, okay, Michael. I'll make it present. All right. student president, if there's any reasonable way that I can. All right, leaving that. They would build up through empire. In the case of Hammurabi, he started out with just the city of Babylon. Then he went and conquered his nearest neighbor, one city-state. Then he got that king on his side, and they went out together and they conquered another. And after 30 years, he had built up an empire that included almost all of Mesopotamia. And this was the beginning of Babylon. But here is the sad part of the story. Their hope, they might say, what was the reason for conquest? Well, until about 120 years ago, conquest was looked on as a virtue. Your civilized people believed that they should conquer the uncivilized in order to civilize them. And it's called virtue of conquest. Today, the conquest is looked on as being very, very bad and very wrong and very evil. But at that time, it was looked on being good. And the idea was to conquer these people, civilize them, build up a whole nation, and eventually conquer the whole world and bring peace to all mankind. There has never been a ruler who could conquer the whole world. Within the last couple hundred years, a couple of men tried it. Their names were Napoleon and Hitler. They failed. Communism had dreams of doing it. It has so far failed. But the idea was we could. But what happened to Hammurabi's empire? Within a few generations, a ruler came along who was not as capable as he was, and the empire failed. Went to fizzle out. This has happened time and time and time again throughout history. Empires would come and empires would go. Anyway, Hammurabi's empire failed. Now,
How did you say it failed? Because somebody came and...
the Hittites. The Hittites came from Turkey, right around this region right here. The Hittites came and they sacked the city. By sack, that means they put everything of value in sacks and carried it off. Sacked the city of Babylon. In football, the word sack has another meaning, but basically they sacked the city of Babylon. And Babylon, it took Babylon 1,000 years to rise back up. They finally did under King Nebuchadnezzar. So Babylon was powerful twice. But anyway, these empires would come, and they would go. There have been many a study made of what caused an empire to go. And folk, we have to conclude a lot of the time they came from trouble from within. They fell from within before they were conquered from without. And this is especially true of the Roman Empire. And if the United States falls, it will be because we constructed ourselves from within. And eventually the enemy realized we're weak and came in and destroyed us from without. But they weakened themselves from within first. And here's what you have. You have a civilization right here, and these civilizations are surrounded by uncivilized people. With few exceptions, the uncivilized eventually come in and conquer the civilized and destroy the civilized. Very few exceptions. You might say, why is that? One reason might be that civilized people have a tendency to limit their populations, have about 1 or 2 children per family. I mean, if you think I'm knocking it, I mean, it's just simply a fact. While uncivilized people will have 6, 8, 10, and 12 babies per couple. Pick the winner. Pick the winner. I see at least one head nodding. But there's another factor. And this, I'm really serious about this, folks, because I think we're doing the same thing. You try to reach out to the uncivilized, and you wind up inviting them into your territory. Now, the prime example are the Romans. A bunch of people from Central Asia, known as the Huns, came in. And the Romans felt sorry for their German neighbors who were living in an uncivilized manner. So the Romans invited these Germans into Roman territory. And the Germans destroyed the Roman civilization. The Germans were basically uncivilized. And I say this being part German myself. The Germans are uncivilized. You let these uncivilized people in, and they'll destroy you. Now, having said that, do I think that applies to the year 2018? I definitely do. Yeah, you may.
So are you saying that uncivilized, what is the definition of uncivilized? I suppose.
People who will come in and steal your children and carry them away and make sex slaves out of them, that's uncivilized. Okay, and that is why that the Chinese people go to Great Wall. These people, these Mongolians would come in and sneak in and steal them before the Chinese army could get together and run after them. To keep them out, they had no airplane. The Mongolians were gone. So the Chinese people go to the wall. Now, my own Scottish ancestors were uncivilized also. And the Emperor Hadrian, one of the richest emperors, built a wall that goes across, still its existence, goes across from the British Isles. It was designed to keep my own uncivilized Scottish ancestors from coming in and stealing everything of value and rushing back to Scotland before the Roman army could come after them. That's uncivilized. Okay, clear on. In other words, people who will, hey, they see you have a nice crop, they'll just come in and take it. Yes, or they see a chance to grab, they'll just come in and take it. Persons who steal are uncivilized. I say that, you may think of this, but here's what happened. Not too long ago at Christian college. A young man went into the president college, complained about the chaplain, said, the chaplain's offending me. Well, the president, how's the chaplain offend you? Well, he keeps preaching against stealing, and I steal. That's why I made a little speech ago about offense. I'm going to promise that you won't be offended with some of the things I say. And you're not protected from offensive speech. You are not. And if you steal, I hope you are offended. All right. Everybody has stolen at one time. Have I ever stolen? Be honest with you, yes, I have. I regret it. I feel bad, but yes, I have. Everybody has done it. It's still wrong. All right, leaving that. Anyway, I will move on from there to, oh yes, I must say this about religion. There is evidence, folk, that the original religion of mankind was monotheistic. Monotheism. As opposed to polytheistic. Monotheism means the worship of one God. Polytheism, the worship of many gods. A lot of persons will argue that I'm wrong, but if you study Chinese history, it looks like at one time they were worshiping just one God. Then they changed. India, they had one God called Deus, but they wound up changing. I've had students that what made them change. And I've already answered that. Some of these preachers came from someplace else and claimed that they were gods and set themselves up to be worshipped, and the people followed them, believed them, and worshipped them. This led to polytheism, worship of many gods. There was a god for the river, a god for the sun. Let's face it, folks. There's one thing about worshiping the sun. At least you know it does exist. If you worship the moon, well, it does exist. And if you worship the wind, well, the wind does exist. Now, I'm not in any way advocating this, because to me, the worship of these creations or entities lead to primitive way of thinking. And okay, I'll jump ahead of myself a little bit. If nature is God, then nature has a mind of its own. And persons who actually believe that nature is God will never develop technology. This device here, probably every one of you have a better one than I'm holding in my hand, has about 1 million little components inside, maybe more than that. If you put together another device like this one, the other device will do the same thing this one. You're going to say, well, isn't that obvious? No. If you believe in polytheism, you believe that this device has a mind of its own. And if you go outside at class and try to start your car, and your car doesn't start, so you decide, well, I'm going to offer a sacrifice to the spirit of automobiles and see if the spirit of automobiles will revive my car, you'll be sent to an insane asylum. because cars are inanimate and they will work. I mean, hey, if everything is right about them, they'll work. They have to. Put together another one just like this one and do the same thing. But polytheistic people believe that nature is God, and therefore they'll never develop scientifically or technologically. So they might say, why is it important? To me, it's very important. Mostly, technology and science have been developed by monotheistic peoples. Now, the ancients tried to determine the will of the gods through divination. They would open up an animal and study the color of its intestines, and that would determine, what am I going to do next? In other words, we oftentimes wish we knew the future. So which way is the stock market going to go? We wish we knew. We don't. Which way is the wind going to go? What's the weather? And I'll tell you some about weather forecasting. When I was a kid, the weatherman said, well, we're right 6 times out of 7 when forecast Mars weather. They're right 6 times out of 7. But if we just had satellites in orbit, well, folk, today they've got their satellites. They also have, first they bought one computer. Then they got myriads of computers, every one of them better than the one they originally had. And today they can predict tomorrow's weather accurately 6 times out of 7. Try and see. The weather still does what the weather wants to do. The weather is inanimate. But anyway, the ancients would try to determine the will of the gods and also they practiced what today we would call voodoo. If they wanted to hurt a distant king, they would build an image of that king and then trick that king with this image or cut off the image of that king's head. They believed this was going to help restore their king. They practiced this kind of stuff.
Who's they?
The ancient people, the ancient Middle Easterners, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, they were practiced right now. I'm still in the Near East. All right, I think I'm going to go on to past the Near East now and move on. There's a whole lot of it. Believe me, now I'll tell you something. I'm so fascinated by the Near East that I could easily spend a whole semester talking just about chapter 1. I have to move on. Egypt. Egypt is but an extension of the Sahara Desert, except for one thing, the Nile River. Take the Nile River away from Egypt, and Egypt would just be desert. Even today, as it has throughout history, more than 90% of the Egyptians have lived right here along the Nile. Now, what you see here is some, what they call oases. They know a water hole in the desert, and they'll build a city or a little small town around these oases. But the big cities in Egypt are located here along the Nile. The Nile River would flood every year, and we now know that the flooding was caused by the seasonal rains that would occur down here around Lake Victoria, far to the south. But the Egyptians noticed was every spring the Nile River would overflow its banks. No rain. In other words, the land of Egypt, until recently, has had few rains, like one rain maybe every 100 years. Now, recently, some of this has changed. There have been some big storms that have hit this region here for whatever reason, I don't know. But anyway, and Egypt has had some rainfall just in the last year or two. But the Nile River would overflow its banks and flood. Now, today, we built the Aswan Dam to stop that flooding. But when the Nile would overflow its banks and flood, it would lay down a fresh layer of soil. And the Egyptians would come in and plant their seeds on the soil, and then they would they'd have to water their gardens from the Nile. And they developed foot pedals that would pump the water out of the Nile River and pump it into irrigation ditches. And some of their foot pedals and their irrigation ditches are more than 1,000 years old. Because in the land of Egypt, things do not decay as fast as they do other places. That's one reason why their mummies have been preserved. The dry sand preserves living tissue much better than it are in other places. Now, in the case of Egypt, we have a phenomenon that will surprise persons who believe that man's culture is not over. The farther and farther back in time you go, the higher and more advanced they appear. Folk, they have, all right, what they have, if you study Egyptian history into some detail, you have the first period, then you have the second period, and the third. During their first period, their early dynastic period, that's when all the periods were built. I mean, all the pyramids were built. All the pyramids were built in the very, very ancient times. They call it the Old Kingdom. Okay, I call it for the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. I'm going to change that. Okay. Yeah, I had a temporary mental block. The Old Kingdom, Middle, and New. In the Old Kingdom, one of the pharaohs dug a canal that joined the Nile River to the Red Sea. You know, I said earlier, later Egyptian pharaohs were not even rich enough to keep that canal from silting up. Part of the canal is still there. You can tell where it was, but it's silted. The desert sands blew over it, covered up part of it, and they didn't have enough wealth, enough money to hire workers to remove the sand and open up the canal. But there was a canal that joined the Red Sea to the Nile River, which meant you could go from Greece over here up the Nile River and down the Red Sea and go to Arabia and even to India before the Suez Canal was dug. But later Egyptian pharaohs couldn't even keep it open. Again, all the pyramids were built by the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom gave way to the Middle Kingdom. The Egyptian history is based on dynasties. You have your first dynasty. The dynasties are numbered. Dynasty 1, 2, 3, 4, that's the Old Kingdom. Then you have an intermediate period where you have chaos. Then you have that intermediate period like dynasties 5 and 6. Then you have the Middle Kingdom, dynasties 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, and so on. Then you have an intermediate period with a couple of dynasties. Then finally you have the New Kingdom. And the New Kingdom was to last about 1,000 years. Now, the Egyptian writing is known as hieroglyphics. When I was at UT, I had a boss who knew I was a history major, who said that my handwriting resembled hieroglyphics. Nobody's more aware than I am that my penmanship is bad. I guess we can all admit it. When I taught fifth graders, I would quote the philosopher Plato when it came to handwriting. I said, "Now, do as I say, but don't do as I do." I'll mention Plato later. One of his famous quotes. My wife says I heard that often used when teaching his children right from wrong. Do as I say, but don't do as I do. Bad example. Anyway, none of us are perfect folk. All right. Now, your book says this about the pyramids. They were burial grounds, that they were for burial. Weirdly enough, if you read the right books, folks, they will tell you that not one body has ever been found in any pyramids at all. And that all the mummies and all were actually buried in the Valley of the Kings, somewhat to the west. Toward the Egyptians believed the dead lived in the west, so they were buried to the west in a cliff along the western side. But nevertheless, okay, what were the pyramids for? The latest theory I've read is that they were to light up the place. This pyramid shape serves as a huge capacitor that would collect cosmic rays and light up the place. So each one of you seem to have heard that. And they went out, the lights went out during Moses' time. But it's known that the Great Pyramid has areas where it seems to generate heat, that some of the inside the Great Pyramid is hotter than others. Be that as it may, there's all kinds of stuff said about the Great Pyramid, folks, including that if you make a Great Pyramid, something the shape of the Great Pyramid yourself, small scale, and put a razor blade in it, the razor blade will always be sharp. And if you put a dead cat's body inside the same shape, the cats will mummify and never decay. believe what you will. I mean, I'm not saying you try this. I'm not trying this myself, but there are persons who have tried it who say that this is so. But anyway, who built it and why? Whatever. Now, something I must point out now, on page 22 of this book, you'll see these this is an original source. I mean, this painting right here is original. And what it shows is that you have people who are brothers, who look, well, like to be brothers. Some of them are black and some of them are white, and some of them are shades in between. As if at one time humanity, would have black and white children in the same families. This has been observed today. We have cases of twins, one white and one black. We know they had the same parents. There's been 50 such cases. White couples will occasionally have a black child or vice versa. Black couples will have a white child who is not an albino. At one time, apparently, it looks like the Egyptian culture had white and black all in the same family, not just the races had not become as distinct as they are today. This picture, by the way, you see on page 22, used to be on the front cover of one of the earlier books. All right. Your book explains it away, though, by saying that, oh, yeah, the Egyptians mingled with the Nubians, who lived right here in the south, was today's Sudan, and the Nubians were black. That is an alternate explanation. But personally, I mean, to me, the pictures I've seen, the original source pictures, the people in them, the men look too much alike, and yet one of them is white and one of them is black. But they look, oftentimes, look very, very much alike otherwise. All right. Again, well, I could spend half the semester at least talking about Egypt. You can learn more. I mean, we know a lot more we did when I was in graduate school about Egypt. In fact, my graduate professor hardly talked about Egypt at all, because he just said he never studied it, didn't know about it. I have studied some myself. We've learned a lot because we're finding more and more of the cuneiform tablets as we dig more into their graves, and we're learning more. And we can tell what each pharaoh did, what each dynasty planned to do, tried to do, and what each pharaoh did. By the way, I've used the word, I assume you know what it means. Maybe you don't. The word dynasty means ruled by a family. Where that a family would come on. Now, the average dynasty only lasted about 3 generations or so. Some powerful man would take over, overthrow the old dynasty to become weak and corrupt. And he would pass the throne on to his son, and that son would pass on to his grandson. Then another powerful man would rise up, and they would overthrow that dynasty. But the dynasty means ruled by a family, usually by passing a throne from father to son. If the father has no son, he'll pass the throne to a nephew or someone close of kin. All right, now, before I leave Egypt, there's one thing I must say. If you read the Bible, the book of Exodus has a highly unusual story about the Egyptians, that a bunch of plagues hit Egypt, 10 plagues. You will find these stories in Egyptian records, but there is one problem with them. Standard scholarship will place these stories some 200 years after the Bible biblical account. The problem with Egyptian chronology, folk, and the problem with ancient dating is it's really loused up because each of these people groups, whether it be Sumerian or Babylon, tried to make it look like they were older than they were by twisting the dates and adding years to the dates. And one method they used, I mean, we have this in American history. We had a period of American history where we had 2 presidents. Their names were Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Now, if you were to rewrite American history and want to make it look older than it is, you could give Lincoln 4 years and give Davis 4 years. You have 8 years there, where actually the 2 terms overlapped. Some of these Egyptian pharaohs were ruling at the same time. We now know that. But the Egyptians would put them end to end to make it look like the dynasty was older than it was. If you really want to make American history really old, if you took every governor we've had of every state and added them one end to end, one after another, you could make America 4,000 or 5,000 years old. When actually a lot of the governors ruled at the same time as the presidents. So the governor of Georgia would be governor of Georgia at the same time the governor of Alabama was governor of Alabama. But it's now known that the Egyptians, and we are trying to go through and redo their history. But anyway, there is some papers in Egypt that have been found that describe the plagues that in the book of Exodus in exact detail, almost flies and lice and locusts and death. It's in the records if you look it up, but standard scholarship will not admit to it. I'm going to have more to say about that in a few minutes. All right, moving on. Indo-Europeans. My personal view, all right, you have Semitic people descended from Shem. Indo-Europeans. Probably descended from Noah's son Japheth. The Indo-Europeans were people who went to the north and they lived in Europe. That's why they're called Europe. But the word Indo comes from some of them began to scatter out, and some of them came down here and lived in Iran. These were the Medes and Persians. And then the Aryans lived in India. We'll talk about that later. Then the Greeks came down and they lived in the land of Greece. And the Latins came and they lived in Italy. So the Indo-Europeans, people started out far to the north, and something forced them south. I think it was an ice age. Now this event I'm about to talk about is very, very pertinent to history, to 2018. The Earth has gone through periods of heating and cooling all throughout its history. Neil Armstrong told us that, and I think an ice age forced my Indo-European ancestors south at some point. When the ice started to melt, they went back north. There was a time, folk, and again, you can look this up yourself. I have, during the Cretaceous period, when the whole Earth had a uniform tropical climate, even the North and South Pole had a year-round tropical climate, no seasons. You think that was hot. And what was life like during that time? Life was never, ever better. There were no deserts. How many of you have heard this? This was the age of the dinosaurs, by the way, the huge reptiles, the huge trees, the giant sea creatures. Life was never better. The hotter it gets, the better life is. I mean, I can just look outside and look like a plant life is thriving. Then comes the cold periods, and people starve. The Black Death was caused by a cooling down. Will it ever cool down again? In one word, my answer is yes. When? Maybe very, very soon. The sun goes through cycles of 350-year cycles. The last cold cycle was in the 1680s. It brought about what we call the Little Ice Age. Killed millions of people. Before that, in the 1300s, we call that the Black Death. The Chinese dynasties appear to have just vanished owing to the cycle of cooling. When the cycle cooled, the emperor was blamed for the famines that came about. It wasn't his fault. They overthrew that emperor and nobody came in prosperity of each other because the climate went back up. Again, if I'm teaching something unconventional, well, Neil Armstrong, I mean, he was no climatologist. He said, well, the climate has always warmed up and cooled down. I say amen to that. But I know he was no climatologist. Anyway, something happened to get these Indo-Europeans moved out. But one thing was about Indo-Europeans, they were stone builders also. The most famous structure they built was the Stonehenge. Now, folk, it appears to me that the Stonehenge was built from stones that were quarried in Ireland. And we have no way of knowing how those stones were transported across the English Channel, whatever, across the sea, from Ireland to England. no way of knowing, could hardly have been done on wooden ships. The stones are very, very large. The Stonehenge appears to show, and it looks like it was a solar observatory, and it appears to show that either the earth shifted on its axis or the tectonic plates that England sits on shifted, but it appears to show that the sun shifted from time to time, and therefore they moved the stones a little bit to compensate for the shifting. I have a book at home that talks about 10,000 stone structures in Europe that nobody knows who built them. They're still standing. They've been there all the time throughout all of recorded history. They're basically prehistoric. Some of them made of quite large stones, and nobody knows who built them. All right. Again, I could spend a whole lot more time talking about Egypt, but I have to move on. Now, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, folk. I'm going to give you a 10 minutes break. I need one myself. Be back at 25 minutes till 12. This is okay. I've talked to other teachers. This is okay to do for a long class.
It seemed like he just talked to me. I don't even know what the test gonna be on. It's just like
This motherfucker was a trip, right?
from the building. Leave.
So you start the class off with all Asians looking like, ouch.
I said, I thought you were gonna say something about black people. I was like, hold on, bro.
I think it's gonna get there. I got a feeling it's gonna get there before the end of this class.
I'm gonna just sit there and look at this. I don't like Jill. Cole.
I got a feeling he's gonna get real comfortable and say what he really feel.
Trump's my president.
Took turns. Not gonna apologize for it. Was it just me or did he say it was some white people in this picture?
I think he said there were white people in there.
I think he did, didn't he?
Yeah, I was waiting for him to talk about that.
What he at?
His opinion on Egyptian integration.
Where he at though?
I'm gonna take a look at it.
He said there were white people in this picture. Am I tripping or did he say that? There's all different shades of color.
Yeah.
Even a cow. Yeah, this is gonna be interesting.
Fight class.
said?
Get a test after you pass the exam.
Yes. I'll have more to say about that in about 5 minutes.
And then is it everything that you were lecturing us on?
It can be anything that I lecture on, that's right. But, okay, let's
So,
listen.
I
Wait,
just-
wait until the whole class arrives. Then you can ask your question.
I just wanted to make sure that if I need to actually get the work,
Oh,
or would I be okay?
okay.
Just in class?
Officially, because I like history so much, I'm going to say yes. But if you don't read it, now this is between me and you, you might not miss it. But actually, officially, I mean, I wish you'd get it and read it. Because history is reading.
But I have a lot of history books that it's still.
If you go to,
Yeah, I just got.
let's see, Google, Amazon, go to Amazon, you can oftentimes find these books on old books, but then there's such demand because so many colleges are using this book that they're hard to find. I'm talking about even the old ones are hard to find. Again, it's not like you're buying some book that nobody wants. I mean, a lot of students will sell them on Amazon. So you might be able to find one that I'm not going to find.
Okay.
But yes, I would like you to read it. Okay, looks like all of you have returned from break, so a couple of you have asked me about the test next week. All right, here's what I want to say about it. I'm going to have to make it up because I've never taught the class this way before, so, and I told my wife we prepared to buy some. I'm not going to make a special trip. I live in Powder Springs, so I'm going to have to print it up on my computer at home. But it's basically like if I put down on the test the word Euphrates, here's what I expect, just a short, you'll get 3 points credit or whatever credit each question you get. If you put down it's a river located in Mesopotamia. So you have to tell where it's located. Now, but if it's a person, for instance, if you put down Hatshepsut, which I did not mention, but I'll make the name somehow. Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a king of Babylon. You have to put the place name. Hammurabi. You put down a Babylonian king, and if you put down someone else, he's remembered for his law code. I'll count that too. But basically, you have to put down where applicable. Now, in some places, like the word monotheism, that's not applicable to a place. That applies all over the world. But where applicable, put the place name, whether it be a river, a city, city of Ur, the place that was destroyed in a fiery holocaust, according to cuneiform tablets. By the way, that quote is one of the most famous quotes that come from Samaria. And if you look it up, you'll find that most people believe it's just a poem, it's just a lament, and it's not to be taken seriously or literally. Again, this is a way that standard scholarship gets around certain things that does not jive with what their own preconceived ideas. Preconceived that man was started out primitive and worked his way up, and that we are the crowning event of man's existence today. I think otherwise. I think that compared to what some of our ancestors were, we today are primitive. All right, any other questions? Yes.
Is the test then not multiple choice?
It'll be mostly, no, there might be a few multiple choice, but mostly matching or fill in the blank. So you know, what is Neolithic? Oh, that's the Old Stone Age. And I didn't even put that down, did I?
So that green scantrons won't, do you need those?
Did I say green? I think I said green scantron. For this test, there'll be no need for green scantron. That much I promise you. Again, I can't use the old test because I've got the chapter in. I make my test up by chapters, and I've got the chapter in different this semester because there's only 7 times the class meets, as opposed to 29 times. So that means I've just got to make the whole test thing. But I have a whole week to do it in. Don't get me wrong, I'll get started tomorrow. And then I'm going to put it off for Thursday and start there. That doesn't work. All right. Yes.
So do we just like study the entire chapter, or is it like a certain?
And with emphasis on the stuff I put on the board.
Okay.
And if I am able to, you'll see this video that I'm making on iCollege, or a link to it. It'll be a YouTube video, but you'll see a link on iCollege. Hopefully, I say today, but it might be difficult for me to do today. These things do take time. And I have another class after this one. All right. Okay. All right, moving on. Well, something I must mention. Egypt is famous for a couple of pharaohs. One of the most famous is King Tut. King Tut's mummy was actually carried to the Atlanta Civic Center a few years back. I did not go see it. King Tut's mummy has been all over the world. It's been infected by parasites, but they found a way to kill the parasites using a certain type of radiation. It appears that King Tut was a boy king who only lived to be about 19 or 20 years old or something like that. Very young. And might have died violently, or might have died of disease. He might have died young because he was inbred. Inbreeding was very common among royalty because they believed that our genes are so much above everybody else's that we cannot mix our genes with those of the common person. So they would oftentimes marry their sister or their fathers or their cousins, with the result that, like any other persons who do that, their offspring would be physically or mentally handicapped, or both. And King Tut might have been in that category. Today we encourage our royalty to marry commoners, because when royalty keeps marrying royalty over generations, after a while they're marrying double first cousins or very close, where they're related on several different lines of descent, and the result is they might as well be marrying their sisters. And the result is their offspring are retarded or physically or mentally challenged. All right. Anyway, another famous king was Queen Hatshepsut. Queen Hatshepsut who took over the throne. Now, this happened a lot of times in Chinese history. It's happened in history. How did a woman take over the throne? Oftentimes, she was the wife of a king who died young, and he died so young that their son was unable to take the throne, so the mother would take over and rule in the name of her son. In other words, she'd say, my son is really the real king, and they actually have their son crowned, but they keep their son in isolation while she did the actual governing and ruling. Hatshepsut the same way. But when Hatshepsut died, her son tried everything he could to erase her memory by throwing her statue into the garbage. But in those, keep in mind, in Egyptian garbage, things did not decay and melt. We found her statue, and it indicates that she must have been a rather quite attractive, intelligent woman. Yeah.
Could you spell that, please?
H-A-T, all right, H-A-T-E-T. King Tut is actually Tutankhamun. Oh yeah, and something else I must mention about Egypt. Their god Isis. That name Isis has come back to the forefront in very recent times. Their goddess Isis, their goddess. Isis had a son named Osiris, and according to the mythology, Osiris died, and Isis tried to revive Osiris, so eventually they worked out a deal with the gods to where Osiris would spend half his time above the, alive, and the other half the earth, the other half the year, he would spend dead, and they would trade places. In other words, Isis and Osiris never meet, because when Isis was going down, Osiris was going up to become alive. And then when Osiris was going down, Isis was going up to become alive. They would never meet. Have any of you heard this myth by any chance? It's a very, very, very common myth in the ancient world, and it had to do with mother and son. And a lot of people believe that this myth was eventually incorporated into Christianity with Mary and Jesus, mother and son. Not that I think so myself, but a myth of the mother who had a son who died was a very, very, very commonplace myth in the ancient world. Now, we're going to hear that name Isis again. What happened as Egyptians worshiping Egyptian gods died out? They were replaced by the Greek and Roman gods. When people lost interest in the Greek and Roman gods, some of them took interest in Isis again. And Isis was worshipped again. And there have been rumors that Isis is secretly worshipped by secret organizations and has been all the way down through recorded history. Your secret lodges will worship Isis as they have from the dawn of time. But they do it in secret. Be that as it may, I mean, each of you can believe what you want to. All right. Moving, well, I'm skipping around, my apologies, but the most famous Indo-Europeans were the Hittites. The Hittites lived in what is today Turkey. There was a Hittite king who came down and conquered Babylon and sacked the city of Babylon. That was what destroyed the original Babylonian Empire. And it took Babylon 1,000 years to recover. Now, don't write this down. The king's name was Shupolululiumus. And no, I'm not going to hold you responsible for that name. But King Shupolululiumus of the Hittites. But one thing I want to mention about the Hittites are mentioned quite a bit in the Bible. And a lot of persons used to say that this shows the Bible was wrong because there were no Hittites. Then we found that not only were there Hittites, they actually were very, very strong, powerful people. But anyway, they came along, and like other civilizations, they thrived for a while, became powerful. Then, for some reason, my guess is they became corrupt, or they started infighting among themselves, whatever. They eventually died out. Today, there are no Hittites left. Or if they are, their descendants do not go by the name Hittite. They mixed and amalgamated with other groups. But this region of Turkey was overrun several times with several groups, including the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, and finally people from distant Mongolia called the Turks. overran it until today's Turkish people are a big mixture, conglomeration of several different types of peoples, some of whom may actually be descendants of the Hittites. All right, now another group, the Phoenicians. From the Phoenicians, we get our word phonetic. Phoenicians. Phonics. Phoenicians lived right here in this region on the Mediterranean Sea. And their big contribution to humankind that has lasted was, while other groups were writing in cuneiform or in hieroglyphics, the Phoenicians wrote in letters that only had about 24 characters. And again, two of my daughters, one of them studying Japanese and the other one Chinese. I gave up on those languages long ago, but I do try to learn Spanish, and I have a difficult time with it. But anyway, the Phoenicians' big contribution, they made up an alphabet, about 24 characters, and each character had its own unique sound. And then they taught this alphabet to the Greeks, and the Greeks wound up giving up their old script. I mean, the Greeks had an old script. They gave an old script for the Phoenician alphabet. And then the Romans also copied the Phoenician alphabet. And this led to Western mankind developing an alphabetic script that was much simpler to learn than cuneiform, and much simpler to learn than Egyptian hieroglyphics. Hey, for about 3 or 4 months, I actually tried to learn cuneiform. And I gave up on it after a while. Very, very difficult language to writing to learn. Again, they used wedges. I could go into more detail, but I won't. Now, there was a bad side to the Phoenicians, though. They were Canaanite people, but they were people who were too powerful that Israel never did conquer. But their problem was, they would, their women would go to their temples, their gods, and prostitute themselves in the temples, and the babies that were born from this prostitution, they would offer a sacrifice to their gods. And the people of Israel used this as justification for going in and trying to conquer the land of Canaan. But again, they were never able to conquer the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians spread out, and they founded the city of Carthage. It came later. We're going to talk a lot about Carthage when we come to Rome, because Rome had to fight 3 wars with Carthage. But the Carthagins were offshoots from the Phoenicians, and the people of Carthage also practiced infant sacrifice. And eventually Rome had to destroy the Carthagins. Now, I recently ran into a YouTube video. I mean, I go to sleep at night all the time listening to these things. A YouTube video that accused Rome of genocide. But the fact of the matter, the way I see it, Rome had no choice, because Rome was the most placable people on earth. When they whipped the city, they'd say, hey, be our ally, we'll protect you, we'll let your sons marry our daughters, and we'll trade with you, we'll help make you rich, you help make us rich. When they got to Carthage, they could not, and after 3 wars, finally Rome went in and wiped them out, sold them off, scattered them all off, sold them to slavery. I can't accuse Rome of genocide. To me, the people of Carthage deserve what they got. If you want to disagree, you're welcome to. There are some people you cannot get along with. But I'm jumping ahead just a little bit, but keep in mind, the Phoenicians. Now, on another front, there have been scholars who claim that they find Phoenician artifacts as far away as Java and the Philippines. And a scholar who's now deceased, who used to write a lot of science fiction, named Cyrus Gordon, found Phoenician artifacts in South America along the Amazon River, and Phoenician artifacts in Minnesota and North America. That he believed that the Phoenicians traveled the entire globe and made. What we do know is that King Solomon of Israel made friends with the king of the Phoenicians. And together, the two of them sent out ships and went to a land, the land of Ophir, and brought back gold and apes and peacocks. And the big question is, where is the land of Ophir? We don't know. But anyway, King Solomon and King Hiram were buddies, more or less. But did the Phoenicians travel all over the world? I think it's possible. But anyway, they did travel throughout the Mediterranean. And they gave us the alphabet, and a lot of their characters in their alphabet we still use today. All right, now it takes us up to Israel. I still have two other empires to go, so I've got to move. All right, Israel. Perhaps of all the ancient peoples, they are the ones who have influenced us the most. Israel eventually got the Western world to change from being polytheistic to monotheistic. And the amount, is that a big contribution? If you ask me, that is a huge contribution to the West, to Western civilization, and to the Western world. Israel claimed that they were descended from three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's three in that order. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, from whom we get the name Israel. That Abraham was told to leave the city of Ur right here, and Abraham left the city of Ur and went to the land of Canaan. And he died in Canaan, so did his son Isaac. But Jacob went down into Egypt, and Jacob's descendants, Jacob had 12 sons and a daughter. Jacob's descendants were to live in Egypt for some 400 years, and during that time they grew from 70 people who went into 2.5 million, and if you think that's impossible, do the math. So there have been persons who have tried to disprove the Bible mathematically. It can't be done. I mean, all right, I'm going to ask you. If someone offered you a penny a day, double for 30, or 1 penny a day, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 cents, 64 cents, or $1 million outright, a penny a day for 30 days doubling, or $1 million, which would you take, the penny a day doubling or the $1 million? How many of you know? 1 cent, 2 cents, 4 cents, 8 cents, 16, 32, 64. For the first 10 days, after 10 days, you get $10. At the end of 30 days, you have $2 million. It's called geometric, 2 to the 30th power equals 1 million plus the million you've already earned before that time, the first 29 days. You've earned 1 million the first 29 days. On day number 30, you earn your second million. Again, I've done it myself. I've done the math on a computer. You can do it in a few minutes on a computer. Anyway, they became 2.5 billion persons. Now, okay, unlike other peoples, they kept their history where everybody could read it. Now, here's the way the Egyptians kept their history. Egyptian history was kept by scribes, and only the scribes, the initiates, had any access to it. And it is now known that these scribes genuinely distorted the history to try to make Egypt look older than everyone else. If you think they were bad, the Sumerians gave tens of thousands of years to the reigns of their first 10 kings. King Elalar reigned 36,000 years, and he was followed by another king from Bad Tabara who reigned some 16,000 years. To me, I think it's greatly exaggerated. But nevertheless, this is how these people kept their history. The Jews, all right, if you think that the Jewish Bible contains some things that are far out, compare it to what the Sumerians said about their history, and then all of a sudden the Jews do not appear to be far out at all. Also, something else about Jewish history. They have made sure that each generation knows their stories. They will meet every year at Passover, and they'll look around the room and say, now who's the oldest one among us? And the oldest one who provided that oldest one still has their mind about him. Okay, you're the oldest. Then they'll say, now who's the youngest one among us? And they'll pick some preschool child, usually who's at least old. It has to be old enough to talk. If it can't talk, the baby can't talk, it's too young to participate. But they pick a preschool child, and this preschool child will go up and ask them, why are we celebrating Passover tonight? And this old person will tell the story. They've been doing this ceremony for 3,000 years. To where even the agnostics among them believe it. I've read books about Jewish agnostics who basically believe it. The story of how that the Egyptians mistreated the Israelites and how that Israel went out of Egypt. And how the waters of the Red Sea parted and let the Egyptians go on dry land. There's been movies made about this. One of the most famous being a movie called The Ten Commandments, which I used to have. But after a while, my VHS tape got old and faded and unusable. Some of you might know what I'm talking about. But, anyway, old movies. But then they went in from Egypt, spent 40 years in the desert where that their leader, Moses, oh yeah, this name I definitely remember, Moses, gave them their law. And Joshua then, after Moses died, Joshua led them into what they called their promised land. And they drove out some of the Canaanites, but they were never strong enough to drive them all out. Like the Philistines, they couldn't drive out. The Phoenicians, they couldn't drive out. The people of Sidon, they couldn't drive out. There were others. They lived in Israel, and they used what they called the abominable practices as justification for them driving out. The fact that these people would sacrifice their babies, human sacrifice. They practiced human sacrifice, and therefore the Jews said we are justified in driving them out of the country or wiping them out. And in some cases, the Jews utterly destroyed every man and woman and child. If you think this is a bad practice, the Jews were not the only ones to do this. Other groups of people felt like they had to do it also. I mean, if you're dealing with people who sneak into your home at night and steal your children, your wife, and whatever, and then rush off before, I mean, eventually you get to where you decide, hey, the only solution is we got to go in and wipe these people off the face of the earth. So I mean, some people who have been conquered will actually deserve it and should have been. If that offends you. Anyway, I believe if the United States has ever conquered, it'll be our own fault. Do we deserve it? Possibly. All right. Leaving that, but the Israelis took over. Eventually, they had some powerful kings. The most powerful kings being David and Saul, his son Solomon. As is the case with every powerful people, eventually King Solomon became unpopular, and the Jews rebelled against his son, and they split into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. Time went by. Eventually, the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by Assyria, whom I will mention in a few minutes. Conquered Israel. And then a revived empire under Nebuchadnezzar, the revived Babylonian Empire, conquered Judah, the southern kingdom. From the word Judah, we get the word Jew. The word Jew comes from the descendants of Judah. But a Persian king allowed someone to go back. Whatever happened to the northern kingdom of Israel when they were carried away captive, we do not know. They were carried away captive and they disappeared from history. There are persons who believe they know where they went. Again, that's a long drawn out topic. But as for the southern kingdom of Judah, when the Babylonian Empire died out and was conquered by the Persians, whom we'll talk about in a little bit, the Persian king Cyrus allowed some to return, and they rebuilt their old kingdom of Judah again. To make a long story short, the Romans came along and they conquered Judah, and they had to conquer them 3 times because Judah continually rebelled. And finally, the Romans drove them out of Judah, and the Jews were to roam throughout the known world for some 2,000 years. And only in 1948 did they start to reassemble as a nation. Again, whether you think they should, that's a whole different matter. But their big contribution, though, was monotheism, which they have eventually spread. Now, I'm going to mention this again when I come to the chapter on Rome because it overlaps. But when the Jews reassembled during the days of the Persian Empire, a lot of the Jews became very unhappy living in Judea. So they scattered out all over the Mediterranean world and scattered out even here into Iran and what is today Iran and Iraq. And some of them never did return. Some of the ones that were conquered by Nebuchadnezzar never went back. Where this led to, well, where this gave Christianity a kickstart was everywhere the Jews went, they would set up their synagogues. They would not try to convert their neighbors to Judaism. You only got to be a Jew if you were born into it, even though they did have a few exceptions. But they would not try to convert to it. They would tell their neighbors that we believe in one God and we believe that He's going to send a Messiah someday. And this meant that everybody throughout the world had heard of Judaism. When Christianity got started, the Christians would first go to a synagogue, the Christian missionaries like Paul of Tarsus, and try to convince the Jews that the Messiah had arrived. When the Jews didn't believe it, then the Christian missionaries went to the Gentiles and eventually converted all of Europe and the Mediterranean world and much of the Middle East to Christianity. All right. I've already mentioned why I think monotheism is important. It's basically monotheistic people who have made the most scientific and technological progress because monotheistic people believe that the world was created by God, but that the world is not God. The sun is not God, the moon is not God, the wind is not God, nature is not God. Therefore, all these things have to obey the laws of God. With that, when you believe that, you can start building gadgets, creating technology. All right. Oh yes, another thing about Israel's religion too, a lot of your ancient religions were not connected with morals. The Jewish religion taught that God had a standard of morality he expected from his people. A lot of your ancients, it was a matter of, morality was a matter of whatever the king could enforce and not a matter of religion. Morality and religion were separate. All right. Okay, I've got to move on. Assyria. Before I go to Assyria, I want to say this. Some of the books that were written 40 and 50 years ago say that the Assyrians disappeared from history. They're wrong. There are 10 million people in the world today who claim to be of Assyrian descent. 5 million of them live right here where the Assyrians always used to live. They call themselves the original inhabitants of Iraq. The Assyrians, they say we're the indigenous peoples, the original inhabitants. And the other 5 million are scattered over the world. But there are at least 10 million Assyrians today. They have not had their own homeland, though, for more than 2,500 years. The Assyrians are known for, among other things, for their use of iron, which led to what we call the Iron Age. They used iron weapons, but also they built up an empire that stretched, well, from what is today's Syria on into, they had a fairly vast empire that joined from the Black Sea, no, pardon me, the Caspian Sea, all the way to the Mediterranean. Now, they fought a war with Egypt, and they also went beyond Egypt and fought a war with Nubia. They fought a war with Nubia, which they won. But they fought wars with Nubia. They were a very warlike people, and also they were a very, very brutal people. And your book shows a picture on page 27 of the Assyrians putting the Jews on poles and basically piercing the poles and impaling them live on poles. So that keep in mind, these Jews were alive when they were stuck through with these poles. Very, very gruesome torture, to say the least. And again, my professor at UT went into more detail, which I'm not going to do. But their tortures, and they would brag on these tortures. They did these tortures against their people openly in an attempt to make people afraid to rebel against them. They would basically torture their enemies. They knew the meaning of fear because being in a wide open country here, they were invaded often. And if you study their history, they had to go to war every spring. They'd leave their home every spring, go out to war, and come in the fall, basically like a Major League Baseball team or baseball team. They'd go out and play the games every spring, and then in the fall they come home, go out again the next spring and play the game. The Assyrians did their wars these way. They were constantly fighting. Their society, it appears to have had two classes: the people who were very, very, very rich at the top, and everybody else in Assyria was very, very dirt poor. The very rich at the top and very dirt poor at the bottom, and this was the way that, and even in fighting their wars, they did not gain a whole lot of booty for their troops, even though they won most of the battles for a long time. Eventually, the people got tired of their rule, and the combined Egyptian and Babylonian army got together and defeated them. And according to the old books, they disappeared from history. This is not really true, but they did disappear as a nation. They tried to revive. They do remember the old days when they were top. Their kings, Esarhaddon and Assurbanipal. Sargon was the one who conquered the northern kingdom of Israel. Now you might wonder, why didn't Sargon conquer Judah? Well, Sargon died during the campaign against Israel. And the next king, Sennacherib, went down to Jerusalem to conquer Jerusalem. But a plague, and according to Herodotus, a plague struck his army. According to biblical account, an angel came down and killed a bunch of them, and when they woke up, the ones that survived woke up, they found all their buddies dead corpses, and they had to leave because there weren't enough of them left to continue to fight. But according to Herodotus, well, Herodotus says rats came into the camp and ate the bowstrings, and without bowstrings they could not continue the siege of Jerusalem. Be that as it may, what we do know is that King Sennacherib did come to the city of Jerusalem and had to leave. So it was 100 years later before Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar's father had defeated the Assyrians. I hope I'm not throwing too much at you at once. But anyway, now, here comes next the biggest empire of them all. With the advent of the Persian Empire, the Assyrians were Semitic, Babylon was Semitic, the Jews were Semitic, these Canaanites, Phoenicians were probably Semitic, the Egyptians were not. But with the fall of the Assyrian Empire and the fall of Babylon that came later, there came a new group of people, the Persians. The Persians came down around 1800 BCE from Indo-Europe and probably forced down by an ice age. There were four groups of people who came down. The Persians were one, the Aryans were another. Now we're going to talk about the Aryans in chapter 2, but what famous 20th century man was really enamored by the Aryans? Does anybody know? Adolf Hitler, yeah. Adolf Hitler claimed that he was Aryan and claimed that the Germans were Aryan. He claimed that the Aryans were the master race. I'll have more to say about that next time. But the Aryans came and took over India. The Persians came down and they took over what is today Iran. And then the Greeks came down and they took over Greece, and the Latins came down and they took over Rome. But four groups of people came down. Your book shows the map of them. A map of them. I saw the page a short while ago. Oh yeah, page 24 in this new book. That the Indo-European, it's believed that the Indo-European homeland was near the Caucasus Mountains. That's why white people often call it Caucasian, because their original homeland was in the Caucasus Mountains. And they spread out from there to throughout Europe and into India and into Persia. Anyway, the Persians. The Persian Empire was as big as, well, it went all the way from Ethiopia to India. Which means it would make the Babylonian Empire look small. It would make the King David's and King Solomon's empire look small. David had no more territory than this, King of Israel. The Egyptians never had any more than Canaan. They conquered Canaan for a while, but Libya they couldn't get because there was a long desert between Egypt and Libya. But Persia had the biggest of all of them up to that time. And part of it, and when we talk about Rome, we're doing the same thing. The Persian Empire was built on decaying empires. In other words, when Assyria was going downhill, when Egypt was going downhill, when Babylon was going downhill, into the vacuum stepped up Persia, and they were able to mop up these empires. Folks, this is going to be what you're going to see throughout a lot of history. Rome was also built on decaying empires. And when the Muslims came out of Arabia, they were able to conquer weakened empires. The weakened empires of this region here. When people become weak, they invite others to come in and take everything they have. And that's one reason why when civilized and uncivilized meet, eventually the uncivilized get on top, come in and conquer. The Persians were initially semi-civilized, but like I say, they conquered Babylon, then they went in and they conquered Egypt. As far as Israel and Judah, they were already conquered. But the greatest king of all the Persians, who's known as Cyrus the Great, King Cyrus, unlike the other ones who were cruel, King Cyrus is a kind man. I'm going to go into a little bit of detail about Cyrus. There were 3 men from the ancient world who, is said as babies, they were thrown into a river in a boat and left to drown. These 3 men were Sargon of Agag, who was a Sumerian, Sargon, Moses, and Cyrus. Moses, who was Israel's lawgiver. The third one was Cyrus. Here was a problem. There were 2 people living together called the Medes and Persians. The Medes were the more powerful. The Persians were like second best. Well, what happened eventually? The Persians became the more powerful enough to be behind. But anyway, the Median king did not have a son, but he had a daughter. His daughter married a Persian. Again, this was designed to help keep the Persian in mind, which meant that the son that was born from the union was a Persian. In those days, he became what your father was. So Cyrus was a Persian. Even his grandfather was king. So his grandfather, the king, decided, I don't want this boy to ever grow up and become ruler. So he put the boy in a boat and shipped him down the river to drown. Some shepherds found him. They reared him up and eventually realized, hey, this young man belongs in the king's palace. They traced him back to the king's palace. Cyrus grew up. And eventually Cyrus got an army big enough to overthrow his grandfather. But instead of killing his grandfather, he gave his grandfather a job, according to at least one account. And his grandfather then had free run of the palace. Cyrus was not afraid his grandfather was ever going to take over. I mean, his grandfather learned he didn't have a chance against the powerful Cyrus. Cyrus then did something that the Jews have always been grateful for. Cyrus said, all you people who were conquered by Babylon and Persia, all you who were conquered by Assyria and Babylon can go home. So the Jews, some of them returned back to their land of Judea. He issued a decree allowing the Jews to return home, and which a lot of them did. And they began to rebuild the nation of Israel. They began to rebuild their temple. And the Persian Empire was destined to last for 200 years. Actually, actually lasted a good bit longer than that because to some extent it's still around. It's called Iran today instead of Persia. They were destined to fight long wars with Greece, and they were to lose when they tried to conquer Greece. And eventually they were to be conquered by a man we're going to talk about in chapter 4, a man named Alexander the Great. Again, when I'm talking about these men, I'd like to think it all of you. How many of you have heard of Alexander the Great? Okay, good, most of you. Okay, Alexander the Great was the man who destroyed the Persian Empire and ended it for a while. But then they revived and they were to go on and on. Eventually they were to be conquered by the Arabs and they were to become Muslim. Today they're known as the nation of Iran. And yes, they do make a lot of news today. And they have made news much of my life. All right, so we'll be mentioning them from time to time throughout the course of the year. Now, one thing I want to mention about Persia, though, is their religion. A lot of persons believe that when Cyrus was captured, when Cyrus was pulled up from the water by the shepherds, that the persons who pulled him up were influenced, or at least may have been Jews, or influenced the Jews who were living in captivity, and they taught Cyrus monotheism. However, Cyrus became a benevolent, kind ruler when he grew up, but also his religion is called Zoroastrianism. Now, I have done some research on Zoroaster, and another thing unique about him was, like the Hebrews, his religion was connected to morals. Zoroastrianism sounds a little bit like Judeo-Christianity. Actually sounds a lot like it, with a few differences. All right, Zoroaster believed that there were two forces at work in the universe, a force for good and a force for evil. The good and evil were equal. But eventually the good would triumph over the evil. That would be at the end of time. But until then, it was our duty to try to fight for the good all our lives, knowing we would not win during all our time. But the fight was to keep on going on and on and on until, and the fight was to keep on going on and on until eventually the good triumphed. But that would take maybe thousands of years. Persian boys were taught, among other things, to speak the truth, to be honest and upright, and have a high standard of morality. This came from Zoroaster. Now, their chief god, and again, Zoroaster sounds a lot like it's monotheism. The chief god was Ahura Mazda. I'm not going to write that down. You have given it a lot already. And again, this means that Zoroastrianism was being, if not outright monotheistic, was close. Now here's where I personally have a quote with Zoroaster. By the way, Zoroastrianism did not survive the onslaught of Christianity. When Christianity came in, the Zoroaster's followers went into India, and their descendants are still there. Christianity did not drive them all the way, but then Islam came in, and Islam finished driving Zoroaster's followers into India, they're still there. The quarrel I have with Zoroaster. Zoroaster believed that once you had taken up the path of evil, you could never become good again. It was a one-way street. You made up your mind whether you're going to be good or evil. I don't know if he believed that a good person could become evil, but he believed that once you were evil, you could never become good. He was almost right. Persons who take up a bad habit, only about 1 out of 20 of them ever return back and change their ways. But where I differ with him is, unlike him, I believe that a person who turns to evil can become good. Not that many of them do. I read a book when I was 10 years old about Sam Bass, and here's what it said: Sam Bass was born bad, he grew up bad, and he died bad. The same thing can be said for Jesse James. Jesse James was born bad, grew up bad, and died bad. Stayed bad all the days of his life. Now, I saw my daughter one time reading, and when she saw that I saw what she was reading about Batman. She was reading about John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde. Any of you heard of these people? Babyface Nelson, Al Capone. I said, go ahead. I enjoy reading about these kind of people myself. I said, you don't think you're going to learn what makes them that way, you won't. Don't think you can learn what can fix them, you won't. But nevertheless, I mean, they were human like the rest of us. We can find something you have in common with them. So I said, go ahead and read about it. But anyway, there are, I dated a girl and I said, I don't believe there are anything like bad people. She never married. I know where she was coming from. There were no good and no bad. All right, anyway. And at the end, the Ahura Mazda would finally triumph, and each soul that would face the judgment at the hands of Ahura Mazda, and the bad would go to hell, the good would go to heaven. Again, very, very much like Christianity, so much so that a lot of people believe that Zoroaster had a big impact on Christianity. All right. Now, what I want us to do is finish the class in a few minutes by stating about what all these nations had in common. One thing that made them different from us, they never separated science, politics, and religion. Now, I've heard politicians say, oh, religiously I don't believe this, but on a political, in politics, I say it's okay. An ancient person never said that. There's science. Now, we have in our modern world a lot of conflict between science and theology, where the science tells us one thing and theology. The ancients never had that. Theology and science were one and the same. Eventually they became separate. Again, in the conflict between science and theology, science would tell us that the universe is millions of years old. A lot of today's theologians tell us that we were created 6,000 years ago, and the universe came into existence abruptly. Each of you can believe what you want to. Science tells us that humans and all life evolved in lower forms, that life develops over time. Theology tells us life was created. Again, it's conflict there. The ancients had no such conflict. Politics, again, their politics was very much entwined with religion. Today we emphasize that church and state should be separate and politics and religion should be separate, but they didn't. Another difference between them and us is they didn't have, now this was changed with the Greeks, they did not have a document called a Constitution. You might think the Hebrew Bible was an exception, perhaps it was, but today's presidents of the United States and other countries will take an oath to promise to uphold the Constitution. We have an election every 4 years, not because some leader orders, but because the Constitution says we should. We obey a document, a written document, that we have obeyed, and it's going to be more than 200 years. They followed a person. Notice, when the last king died, a new king would come up, and the new king would have 50 days to decide which laws he wanted and which laws he didn't. So he'd make his laws, and everybody was expected to keep those laws. Those laws would be written down, and messages would carry them throughout the kingdom and say, as of now, this is acceptable and this is not. But they followed a man. Now, I want to say that I was in the Army for a while. I was in the Guard for 6 years, and one thing they emphasized, when you meet an officer, you're expected to raise your hand and salute. All right, but they said you're saluting the office that person holds and not the person who holds it. In other words, if you see a man coming at you with double bars on his collar, that means he has the rank of captain. You're saluting. You're saluting the bars, not the person. You might think the person is a louse, and maybe the person is a louse. I don't even know most of the officers I knew were what I call pretty good persons, but they say you respect the office, not the man. Well, in the ancients they got that backwards from us. You respected the man, not the office he held. The person who held the office, and you followed the king because he was king. But you followed him because of his charisma, his ability to lead. And you didn't follow him because you followed him if you liked him. If you didn't like him, you rebelled against him. That is why in England we have not had a dynasty change, not really, in 1400 years. Queen Elizabeth traces her ancestry to King Cerdic, who lived in 400 AD, 1600 years ago. Again, we don't have dynastic changes. But in the ancient world, when you didn't like the king, you rebelled against him, put a new king in. For the most part, we frown on that today. Now, it has been done. But you follow the person and not the office. Today, we emphasize you follow the office, not the person who holds it. We've had presidents in my time who, quite frankly, I did not like. But I respected them. I respected the office they held. Not the men who held them necessarily, but the office they held. Okay. These people, again, very, very religious. Most of the religions were not connected with morality. Their religions were a matter of the good life was if you can get ahead, that's what, basically, he who dies with the most toys wins. You used to see those bumper stickers, he who dies with the most toys wins. You don't see those anymore because people got to think, well, hey, this is not true. He who dies with the most toys is still dead. But basically, they believed that the idea was to get ahead by any means you could. Zoroaster and Judaism and Moses taught, live a good life here and you'll be rewarded for the good life you live. I will say this, the early Jews did not have a concept of heaven as such. They followed Moses' law because they believed the reward would be here and now. Now later on, they had a concept of heaven, and a lot of persons say they picked up this concept of heaven when they were carried into Babylon, and they ran into Zoroaster and they said, hey, this sounds great. Personally, I don't believe that, but the concept of heaven or hell appears to have not been in the original Jewish doctrine. But it came later. Their law was a matter of what the king said and not a matter of something that would be the same from one generation to another. Okay. Leaving that, I pretty well covered chapter 1. I want to talk a little bit more about the test I'm going to give. Mostly this first test will be, okay, here's what you'll see. You'll see a name. Let's see. I'll give you full credit for that if you can tell me at least two things about he was a religion, or no, he was a god. And say something about Persia, the place. I may be repeating something I said earlier, but basically he was the god of Zahirma, the god of the Zoroastrians, the location, Persia.
So basically the who, the what, and the where.
Yeah. Now again, there will be some questions to where the where will not be relevant. And questions like what is monotheism, the where is not relevant in that case. But everywhere where if it's a river, I want you to tell me where. All right, now, it's a river. The river, well, if you don't tell me where, I'll count off at least a point. The river is in Egypt. But if you try to tell me that the Nile is the name of a Persian god, you'll lose all 3 points for that. All right, now again, I hope to have the video online, hopefully by late tomorrow. I'm not going to hold a firm promise that, but I hope to have it online by late tomorrow. Again, I'm not sure if I can. I won't get home until late tonight. I have another class right smack dab after this one. But I do have videos of this lecture, these classes online, already there. That you can look at. But, oh yeah, somebody asked me, should you buy the book? My answer to that is, I really wish you would. Now, I put 2 daughters through college. My son elected not to go. And I know these books are expensive. And my day, a book like this would cost $12 to $15. Today, they're more than $100. You might find the earlier version on Amazon. But again, this book is very popular among colleges. I mean, I guess a high percent of colleges use it. Very popular, so they can be hard to find. They're still in print, so that you can easily find a new one at your college bookstore. But I would like for you to read the book. Can you pass the class without reading? I'm supposed to say no, if you, because, well, all right. Read the book. Well, officially, that's what you heard me say. I like history. History is primarily reading. But regrettably, we have so much material, we have so much little time, that I've got to pick out what I think is important. So that's why the test will come from what you saw here in the book. Yeah.
Did you ask how many questions?
Generally about 30, that's why I'm saying 3 points apiece, 30 to 35 questions. That'd be 3 points apiece with 1 point if you've taken off, you don't have this, another 2 points if you, and each question decided, well, this answer is good for 1 point off, or this one's good for 2, or this answer is just completely out of it. It's all 3 points off. Regrettably, when I'm grading these, there will be students who make grades down in the 20s and 30s, and folk I don't know how, I mean, I don't know why, except if you don't just simply don't study. I believe if you listen to the lecture, and if you'll look at it again, or if you'll study what you wrote down, that you can't help but make at least a 75 to 80 on the test. What the department head knows, 2/3 of my pupils who finish my class make A's and B's. And as for the other third, most of them make C. Well, most of them drop, quit. But the other grades are mostly C's. It's rare that I give a D, and the only F's I give are the students. Now, I started to say students who don't do the paper. There is no paper. The only F's I generally give are to students who simply quit coming to class and don't take the test and don't offer to make them. I never hear. I'm not going to track you down. Now, there was a part-time teacher last fall who I could tell he was calling his student to remind, you're going to fail the class if you don't come to class. And I said, okay, I'm sorry. I couldn't help but overhear what you were saying, but I don't do that myself. He said, well, I don't know if I should, but I've got several students who said, what you should do is work with the ones who are there and who are trying and leave these others alone. That sounds cool and awkward. I'm not going to apologize for it. I'll work with you if you'll work with me. And if you won't, if you quit coming to class, I'm not going to track you down. I don't believe you should.
So these videos will be posted on iCollege then?
I'm going to try to. I say it takes hours because I've got to first convert them to a format. I mean, that camcorder makes an MP4 video, which I've got to convert to a format to YouTube.
Right, and you said that it was
It takes
possible
time.
to pass the class just using the videos and...
In view of the way I have to conduct the course, I think it is. Because what I would like to do, and what I usually do is, I get questions of the book, but I did not mention in class. But because there's, I've thrown out so much material to you in such a short time, and my department had advised, I kind of made over backwards for you. So, I'm just whispering out. You might pass the class without buying the book. Don't tell anyone, don't let that get any farther than this.
The things that you have on iCollege that were kind of tools.
Oh, and
Yeah,
yeah,
it's
I've got some stuff on iCollege. And one of the stories I got on iCollege was a story about in Merikar and the Lord of Arata. I forgot, all right, I've got a few minutes. Thank you for reminding me. In Merikar, I would like for you to read it. In Merikar was a Sumerian king, and he engaged in a long war between Uruk and Arata, and oh yes, Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was the king of Uruk also. Gilgamesh went to visit someone who had survived the flood, who had been on the ark. And if you believe, like Gilgamesh actually talked to someone who'd been on the ark. Gilgamesh was 2/3 God. No, he was like these other who they were part God and part human. And in the story, and again, these people consider this serious history. Merkar was given superpowers, the ability to move at super speed between Arata, which was way over here, and Uruk, which was over here, and he could cover this 1,000 miles in a matter of a few minutes because he befriended an Anzu bird, a baby Anzu bird one time, and the mother finally found that, oh, because you've been so nice to my Anzu bird, I'm going to heal you and give you super abilities. But there's an interesting line in that story. When the gods came to Merkar, and Merkar took sick and they abandoned him and said, you go in the cave and you just die in the cave, we're going to move on. So Merkar was left in the cave to die. He called on the gods, but he could sense, and this is in this line, he could sense the sheer evil in the gods. I mean, this was their own work, folk. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because in Merkar, I want you to read that story, because it's actually original. It comes from that time. It shows their mindset. And the first lesson I took when I took ancient history at UT, the professor emphasized those people were of a different mind than we were. There were no atheists in the very ancient world. There were no agnostics. There were no skeptics. I mean, after all, like I said, the river does exist. The sun does at least exist. But they had no skeptics. That came from the Greeks. Now, with the Greeks who came later, the Greeks, they had no democracy. Now, the Greeks had democracy, the Greeks had a constitution, and the Greeks had some skeptics among them. We'll talk about it. Now, next time, in addition to taking the test at the end of I'll start the test probably around 12:15. In addition to the test, we'll talk about China and India. Chapters 2 and 3, and possibly go on and begin with chapter 4, Greece, and Rome. I mean, I've got to check my own syllabus. But I wanted to give more time to chapter 1 than I gave to all the other chapters, owing to the fact that, well, chapter 1 is my favorite. And owing to the fact that it's so diverse and has covered so much territory. With chapter 2, we go to China. Chapter 3, India. We're going to have it reverse. Chapter 2, India, they go to China. But anyway, we go that way. All right, anybody else have any further? I mean, okay, you meant to ask some more.
No, that was about.
Okay, that one. Yeah, and I also have another thing in there about the United States Constitution. Well, I think I put it there. Some student in another college wrote a paper about how terrible the United States Constitution is. He's from South Asia. This man it was. And he's forgetting that in his own country, they have never had 4 years of civil peace, not in his lifetime. But he taught how terrible. We once had 4 years of war. Now, catch this line. In his paper, he says that the United States, oftentimes, our senators disagree with our president. Do you know something? That's true. Now, isn't that just awful? Isn't it terrible? We believe in the freedom of dissent, and that's why we make so much technological and scientific progress. Technological progress is made by people who are free to disagree, where the norm says you can't do it, but somebody says I can. That's dissent. Without dissent, there's no scientific or technological progress. You have to be free to dissent. My wife disagrees with me sometimes, and sometimes, much too often, well, she was right. Much too often. You have to be free to dissent. But again, I throw this paper in, says most of my class, just to show the mindset of that part of the world, the people living in that part of the world, and they forget that they don't have any kind of peace at all. They keep fighting among themselves, and yet our Constitution is so unworkable and so terrible. I believe that's in the. Did I include that or not? I think I did, because I uploaded the other day. I uploaded the whole thing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay, I
the
did.
Constitution's a failure. Yeah, it's just something I threw in just to show.
Okay, yeah, I didn't.
Oh yeah,
that
just that's your people do have different ideas about things and different thoughts about things. Yes, and oh yeah, I have comparative religions and comparative societies also downloaded. This is all, that comparative religion is all me. I'm not going to teach from it. I don't have time. But I'd like you to look at it. And also comparative countries. Some countries, see, they remain united, like China has remained united throughout history. Others, like India, has been divided throughout history. And Europe was united in the days of the Roman Empire, then it's been splintered ever since. different parts of the world, what they have had, which we'll touch on from time to time as we go through the lesson. All right, anybody else? Okay, with that, folks, I feel like it's been a good class. I hope you've been shaken up, stirred up, and I hope to see all of it back next week. Oh yeah, one other thing. Patrick Hutton. Did Patrick ever show up? Okay, thank you.
You said, the Syrians?
Yes.
They were between